This past semester, I had the privilege of teaching a course for the Vocal Pedagogy certificate at NYU Steinhardt entitled Vocal Repertoire for Teaching 2. The goal of this course was to assess as many songs from the musical theater and contemporary commercial music canons as possible. Each week, we considered a different musical era or style and assessed a number of songs using a rubric my colleague Scott Murphy and I adapted from Christopher Arneson and Lauren Athey-Jenka's book, Literature for Teaching. Over the course of the semester, through our work in class and through midterm and final projects, we completed assessment rubrics for a breathtaking 250 songs. Shout out to my amazing pedagogy students whose presence, thoughtfulness, and passion made that even possible. In addition to assessing each of the songs, we had very frank and thought-provoking conversations about selecting repertoire with students and how to help singers overcome the technical and artistic challenges songs may provide. Questions necessarily came up. How do we match a student's current skill to appropriate repertoire while also inspiring them to grow in their freedom of expression? What happens when we select something that is maybe beyond their ability? How might we engage students to think about their essence as a performer and the ways that might impact their repertoire selection? How can we move beyond the binary and find something that feels bespoke to each singer? Does it matter if we transpose the key of a song or not? So many great, tough questions came up. And it was a deeper reminder to me of just how challenging it is to strike a balance between selecting songs that inspire vocal efficiency and artistry and those that might hold a singer back. Hi, my name is David Sisco. My pronouns are he, him, and welcome to my podcast, Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. This podcast is dedicated to the art and practice side of teaching singing. It is an extension of my forthcoming book of the same title, which will be released by Routledge Press this coming summer, 2025. Today, we're going to have a conversation about selecting repertoire with the student. My very special guests are Zipporah Peddle and Paul M. Patinka. I'll be happy to introduce you to them in just a little bit, but first, let's continue talking about rep. As I've already noted, selecting repertoire challenges teachers in a number of ways. Certainly, the engagement of an assessment rubric, which grades things like range and tessitura, registration, respiration, vowel sequences, and diction, and so on, can certainly help teachers refine their repertoire selections. And yet, there are several other hurdles we should consider. For instance, I want to start by pointing out that there is no universally accepted graded repertoire list for Western classical, musical theater, or CCM repertoire. Certainly, respected pedagogues have put out and put forth different ideas, but like anything, these lists age rather quickly. Some competitions provide a graded repertoire list, but when analyzing one of them in my book, I found a breathtaking lack of diversity in the recommended composers. In a fantastic article for Intranos, Paul and Patinka completed an exhaustive analysis of the 2017-2018 NATS National Student Auditions, and they found a similar issue, even though the competition does not publish a specific repertoire list. Certainly, vocal anthologies can sometimes be a go-to for voice teachers because they often offer recommendations for the beginning, intermediate, and advanced singers. But again, my analysis in the book showed a similar lack of diversity, especially in Western classical and musical theater anthologies. Beyond a lack of a graded repertoire list, we need to talk about Fach and voice classification. We need to acknowledge that not all voices neatly fall into classifications of soprano, mezzo, tenor, and bass. Also, these classifications are still very binary, distinctly female and male. In addition, the employment of Fach in opera was specifically created to divide singers up into particular categories. Author Kwame Holmes argues that this creates inequity. He writes, Fach may remind readers of racial categorization because the voice, as experts call it, is both objectified and reduced to physical characteristics like size and color. Scholars need not search through the archives to find evidence for the persistent racialization of vocal type. There are other concerns for us to consider, such as how do we engage with overdone repertoire, especially if the student is really eager to sing a song? How do we ensure that we select songs with students that are well written without promoting our personal taste or other subjective measures? Clearly, we are not going to answer all these questions today, but what all of this underscores is that we as voice teachers need to be more intentional when it comes to considering repertoire selection. And that's where our two fantastic guests come in today. Zipporah Peddle is an assistant professor of voice and vocal pedagogy at Boston Conservatory. She previously served on the theater faculty at Missouri State University, where she created a program of CCM style and pedagogy courses for the BFA musical theater program. She led private voice studios in Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Toronto, and regularly provides master classes on musical theater and CCM styles. She has presented her research on professional singers for NATS and PAVA and has appeared as an invited speaker for NATS and the Voice Foundation. Ms. Peddle sang in nearly 3,000 performances as lead vocalist in Cirque du Soleil's top-selling production show, O. She's performed in musicals, concerts, cabarets, new musical workshops, tours, and recitals at venues throughout the United States and Canada. Ms. Peddle holds a Master of Music in Vocal Performance from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a Bachelor of Music from Memorial University in Newfoundland, Canada. Paul and Patinka lives in beautiful Providence, Rhode Island as a voice pedagogue, independent researcher, and freelance musician. They are a faculty member of Dean College, Providence College, and Ensemble Performing Arts Studio, and serve as an associate editor of the Diverse Voices column in the Journal of Singing with Zipporah Peddle, and as the New England Region Governor of the National Association of Teachers of Singing. Paul's collaborative and independent research has been published in the Journal of Singing, the Journal of Voice, and College Music Symposium, and presented at national and international conferences. Zipporah, Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Excited to be here. Thank you.
Oh, it's my honor, truly. I just think so much of both of you and your work. We love a good origin story here on the podcast, and so I was just wondering how both of you met and kind of discovered your love or maybe obsession with repertoire selection. Zipporah, can I start with you?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's really a testament to some of the organizations that have been creeping up, trying to create more sense of community. NATS does a great job with that, and the Voice Foundation, and then PAVA more recently. And so Paul and I had been involved with some work in PAVA and had been on some committees together. And then I was at, I believe was it NATS or Voice Foundation? It was one of their conferences. Paul was presenting a poster and we just got chatting. And then Paul invited me to be on a project. And then we discovered that we liked working together and everything kind of blossomed and flowered from there. And I will say that I feel like finding a really wonderful research partner is a little bit like finding a life partner. It's like when you find someone that you really jive with, it is so satisfying. And so we've done a number of projects together now. We just love working together.
Yeah, so we met, it was in Chicago. That's where we first had our first in-person interaction, Chicago Nats. And we had met several times online before that, but that was our very first in-person, face-to-face kind of thing. And Zipporah is the collaborator's collaborator. She is phenomenal to work with, and we really just sort of hit it off the bat right away. And that has now spiraled into all these other fantastic projects. So it was meant to be.
Paul, you in one of your articles, I believe, wrote that you've made this really great argument that a lack of representation in the traditional music canon can impede a student's process of self-actualization. And I was just wondering if you could maybe speak on that a little bit more, because I believe it's a really potent point.
Sure. I think one of the things that we see a lot in psychology research, but also education research is the idea that if you can see yourself and your culture and your history and who you are as a person represented in the media around you, that you feel better about yourself. You have higher self-esteem, you have higher success rates in academia and things like that. And it's even, linked to higher health outcomes as well, because you feel less stressed. You feel like you're a part of a bigger community. And so the same thing applies to the musical repertoire that we, perform with our students, that we are performing ourselves. That if a student can't see themselves represented in that music, or their culture represented in that music and by the people who have created it, it's harder for them to feel connected to it. And I think that first study that I did, looking at a huge data set of repertoire from the Nats National Student Auditions, really showed that there just was a lack of any kind of diversity in that repertoire. And so I went on to look into some other research down the road, and really discovered that it does have an impact on people's sense of belonging. And you could see this during the pandemic as well, when students didn't have their peers to interact with and had a lot of issues with socialization because, they were interacting with their parents or their family members who are not necessarily the exact same culture as them. And as we came out of the pandemic and into, the world that we are now, those things started to go away because people were able to connect with other people around them that shared that similar community. So the argument that I really have for this is that music is a form of media. Even when we think about Western classical arias and things like that, it's a form of media that represents something to students. And when we don't have any people of color or any queer composers or lyricists in our data sets or in the repertoire that we're hearing and performing, it makes a difference because the students don't see themselves there. So that's really my big argument for it. And I think the study, which we'll talk about in just a little bit here, I think really reflected that as well, showing that it does matter to people when they perform music from their own culture in their studies.
Yeah, and if I could just add on that, this is not unique to music. This is something we see in all types of different creative fields. And for your listeners, if they're interested, I found there was a TED Talk by America Ferrera about this, about how she saw herself. She's Latinx, and she was coming up as an actor and wanting to be a part of this industry, and just seeing very specific sort of tokenized types of roles for people who look like her. And just how difficult that is to see yourself, to put yourself in, these artistic fields when you really feel like you're not, the authentic version of yourself is not being represented. And so I think it seems like it could go without saying, but I think we have to just keep reminding ourselves and reminding the broader industry of how important this is, that students have this positive reflection of who they are.
Absolutely. And, Paul, as you mentioned, you both just recently published an article in the Journal of Singing entitled Musical Selection in Western Classical Academic Voice Studios. Does composer-singer identity alignment matter? And it's really fine scholarship. I just want to recommend everyone who listens to the podcast to please check that out. It just came out in the January-February issue, I believe. And I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit about your study and its findings.
Sure. So this study took place during the pandemic when we were all in lockdown because of COVID things. And essentially what I wanted to look at in the data collection was the idea of, if we gave a student a piece of music that reflected exactly one part of their identity, would it matter to them? And just to see what would happen afterwards. And so I started that project during the pandemic and did a bunch of data collection. And then coming out of the pandemic, when Zipporah and I met in Chicago, very fortuitous, I said, I have this giant pile of data. Would you like to help me go through it? And she said, sure. And hopefully doesn't regret that now. But so we spent a long time really going through that. And the results of it were that we picked 3 student faculty pairs who each shared some kind of minority identity. So for example, there was 1 Asian faculty, there were 2 Latino faculty, and there was 1 student who had a queer representation in their identity. And then we asked them to work together to figure out pieces that represented something about the student's life. So for example, the queer student initially picked a piece by Handel because that was sort of an immediate connection he had. And then later actually didn't feel quite as connected to it, given Handel's historical distance from the modern day, and so switched over to Ricky Ian Gordon, and he felt much more connected. And then down the road after that, really thought about doing an entire senior recital of all queer composers because he enjoyed the aspect of it that much. And so, we asked about the background of the faculty members and we asked about the background of the students to get a sense of especially the faculty members, had they ever done anything like this before, either in their own teaching or in their own work with other teachers. And they all basically answered no. This was not something that had really ever come up in their previous studies. And I think for Zipporah and I, that was one of the really big takeaways, is that this isn't something that necessarily is being thought about on a large scale. But after the students spent a semester with this repertoire and spent a semester working through it and learning it and talking about how their own culture intersected with it, at the end of the study, they all said it made a difference in their performance and their practicing. And I want to put the caveat on this that it's a qualitative study, which is important, I think, for singing studies because we have a lot of data about how the voice works. And there's always more things to learn, but we don't necessarily have data on the student and teacher experience and about what we're actually doing in the practice room and in the voice studio. And so I think this was a real deep dive for Zipporah and I to look at, is this something that might work in other places? Is this something we could advocate for, and does it make a difference? And I think the answer to all three of those questions was yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really came up for me as we were looking through the data was the disparities between the students and faculty in terms of their musical experiences growing up in, junior high and high school, at home, versus their experience then going on to learn in an academic institution. I mean, you can argue, depending on what the student wants to do, if you decide I'm going to have a career as a coloratura, opera singer, or I'm going to be a musical theater singer or jazz singer, whatever, you can argue that going into one kind of funneled track is the way to go. But I think that a lot of people initially, their inspiration to pursue a degree in music, right, has to do with this like wide variety, this whole kind of pot of things that they've experienced. Community building, familial ties and memories, and all these things that we associate with music. People think I'm good at this thing. Maybe I should do it, in my undergraduate degree. And so I think the reasons the students were pursuing these degrees was very detached then from their experience of what they were often studying in the actual degrees. And so I just think it's something, particularly as those of us in academia look at, program numbers, how do we keep recruitment high? How do we engage students? How do we prepare them for the industry as it is right now, right? Looking at that kind of impetus, that initial reason the student came in, and then what the skills they need to learn to have a career as a singer in 2025. I think those are really important things for us to be thinking about, And so, as Paul said, this engagement around being a woman, singing a piece by a woman, having some sort of a sense that I could also achieve that greatness. I could also, be a part of this really elite group of people who are doing this at a high level. I think those are all really engaging things for students.
I'm so fascinated by the research you do and how contextualized it is, how applicable it is to our everyday life. And I'm just wondering how your kind of story kind of brought you to wanting to find that intersection.
I think Paul and I, when we started, working on a couple of different related projects together, we were both really interested in the intersection of wider education studies and music studies with the singing community, right? So that was like one element of it. So something like culturally responsive pedagogy, which has been pretty widely written about in education and music education, but not really in singing studies, right? Like, so okay, how can we take some of that and maybe interpret it in a way to help teachers more easily, move into this space? That was really important to us. In terms of the qualitative and quantitative data, I'm sure most of us are aware that all kinds of research are needed, right, in singing studies. But because what we do is such a in the room, person to person type of thing, it wants qualitative research. It wants qualitative research. It wants us to really examine, people's experiences, how they're feeling, how things, impact them. And data can't necessarily do that for us.
Yeah, and I think there's this great quote that it sticks very vividly in my head of a professor in grad school, who said, "Music is philosophy." And at the time, I thought, I'm not really sure what that means. But spending a lot of time since then thinking about it, I think that it lines up exactly with what Zipporah is saying, in that what we do is based on philosophy and values and culture, and that music is not separate from those things. It's not its own sort of enigma that exists out in the universe, but it's a part of who we are, and it's a part of our identity, and our voices are also a part of our identity. And I think the thing that I've really tried to do in my research, and especially with Zipporah, is, like you said, David, the contextualizing, because it's not enough to say this was a couple people's experience, but then to say it was a couple people's experience, and here's 40 years of musicology research that says similar things, and 40 years of music education research that says similar things. And then here's a massive data set looking at the repertoire that reinforces exactly what we are saying, so that it's harder, I think, to ignore it. And I think that's something that Zipporah and I really value, is this blending of the two, so that it's rooted in the student experience and the teacher experience, but it still is also informed by hard numbers and facts, if you will. Because I think when we don't have that, it's easier to dismiss and easier to say, well, maybe that's someone else's problem. And voice studies can be pretty lonely because, we're in a practice room with our students, which is great, but we often don't get the time to collaborate with colleagues as much as I'm sure we all would like to. And so I think it's easy to say, well, I'm not really seeing this around me, so maybe it's not as big a deal as they're saying it is. But when we combine the two data sets like we have been, it's a lot harder to ignore that way. It shows that there's not only individual issues going on, but also systematic issues in the way that we've created voice studies in the US.
Yeah, preach. You're setting me ablaze. This is exactly, yeah, exactly what I wanted to talk about. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Zipporah, I know that you teach repertoire classes at BOCO, and I was wondering what other challenges you maybe have found that young pedagogues are facing when you have conversations with them about assessing and selecting repertoire with students.
Yeah, I mean, I think repertoire selection is something, for those of you who are newer teachers, I promise it gets a little easier the more you do it, right? The more familiarity you have with pieces, the more you've worked on them with different types of singers, and you start to get a sense of, oh, this piece will be successful with that person or this person, And because we're looking at the students so holistically, there's so many different factors, in terms of all of the technical goals we have for them. What are they planning to do with it? Are they avocational? Are they pre-professional? Are they professional, et cetera, right? And then, of course, all the things that we can't maybe quantify, like, what kind of person are they? What's their essence? What are they? What's their vibe? What are the kind of characters they might see themselves playing? There's just so many things, as you know, David. And I love, I was actually reading, because you were talking about, I think, in some of our correspondence, the course you teach, and you were talking about some of the classical art song interpretation books that exist. So books that allow us to, for example, say, well, this is on a scale of 1 to 5. This piece is a 1 agility and a 2 for this and a 3 for that, right? So we're trying to quantify it a little bit. That doesn't exist in musical theater, and I'm primarily teaching musical theater right now. And I did something very similar to what you did. I basically took the idea and then tried to apply it to some of the musical theater repertoire that I was looking at, But I think to get back to your question, so it's a very complicated process for everybody, right? The more we do it, the more we hopefully get better at it and feel more comfortable in it. But I think it's really the bringing together of the technical with the other things, right? That is the trickiest part. Technically, I would probably say that, issues around registration, right? Registration, navigation, that kind of thing can be really tricky for beginner teachers to figure out. And
Sure.
particularly with voice types that are dissimilar from theirs, right? So it might be harder for me as a woman who is a soprano now singing more mezzo stuff to really understand what a baritone voice feels like, right? But again, as you work with singers, you start to kind of sit into that a little bit more and get more comfortable with it. Yes, that's a kind of a rambling answer to your question.
Oh, it's a great answer to the question. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and that's what I found too in the course this past fall is like there were so many, and we were really, I perhaps I was just really going home like we're going to cover as much repertoire as possible. But we did try to leave time for conversations, about like, can we change the key? Where, like in musical theater, especially, like obviously in CCM, that's expected, and even arranging is expected. But in musical theater, what are the rules and when can they be broken and things like that? All those types of questions that come up, and I think it's, I loved really hearing from young pedagogues about what they were thinking and how they were engaging with that process of selecting repertoire with the student. I think it's so important to look at it and not just say, all right, here's how we assess songs, right? That is certainly a piece of it. But what you're speaking on that really, again, lights me up is this idea of that there are all of these other things other access points that we have to meet as well, I think.
The other thing I'll just say quickly about that is, I think sometimes as teachers, and again, thinking of myself when I was first starting out as a teacher, we kind of have this like, FOMO, like we feel like we have to, fake it till we make it and pretend we know all the things and we're the masters of the universe and all the things, right? And I have really found specifically with repertoire selection that engaging my students in that process, having it be collaborative, it makes your life so much easier. We can spend hours and days hoeing and humming over, oh, are they going to like this? Is this right? Is this right? And then sometimes our students will come to us with pieces and you're like, that is the perfect piece for what I was trying to come up with, right? They introduce us to new material. We learn a lot about who our students are through the kind of music they're interested in, the kind of stories they want to tell. I will often ask my students, maybe this semester, tell me some roles that you're super interested in this semester, now tell me where are the gaps in your book? Where is this, who are some singers you look up to? All of these things are like little kind of pieces of information that can help me align the kind of repertoire I'm suggesting a little better. And I've just found it to be much more successful and satisfying when it is a collaborative process.
I've been very intentional in this episode about talking about selecting repertoire with the student. And that is, it is a very student-centered, it should be a very student-centered process. And so I was just wondering, based on your research and which I know continues, and your individual work, if you have recommendations to listeners about ways that you try to engage in equity and student-centered repertoire selection.
I think one of the great models, and I'm sure Zipporah will also agree with this, is the Brian Montronac idea of the student veto option, which is in the Journal of Singing, because it gives the students authority and agency in their teaching to be able to say, I don't want to sing that. And it doesn't matter why, doesn't matter the reasoning. And in that article, he's specifically talking about like racially identified repertoire with students. But I've really adopted that for all of my students, and especially for my younger ones, my middle schoolers and high schoolers, to give them the agency to say, this doesn't vibe with me, I don't want to do it. Because there's so much music out in the world, I don't want to force someone to do something that they don't like. And then we spend a lot of time where they're not practicing and we have to figure out all the nuts and bolts together. And it ends up just wasting a lot of time and being unproductive. Um, and so, that process for me of selecting with a student really involves both of us bringing pieces to the table that we think might be good for whatever reasons, sitting down, listening to them together, and then talking through, this is why I picked this, because I think it would help build these technical facilities in your voice. Or you're missing this from your book, and I think this would be a great piece because you fit this character really well. Or you really need a French aria. So here's a list of French arias that I think would fit your voice. And going through that with them, because first it educates them and it helps them develop their own listening skills, because when they leave your studio, they're going to have to pick music on their own anyway. So that's a skill that's really important for me to cultivate. And then secondly, it gives them the opportunity to hear what I am hearing and for me to hear what they are hearing in their music and get a sense of why do we think this might or might not be a good piece. And then afterwards, if they decide they don't want to sing something, I usually ask them to bring a piece that fits the technical goals we were talking about or fits the sort of criteria as a way of like a little homework, that it's fine if you don't like it, but let's now go figure out something that you do like so I can learn from that. And just like Zipporah was saying, I think, students bringing in repertoire, I learned so much from. There's been very few cases where I've said you really have to learn this piece, and typically it's for a show coming up or an audition or something like that where there isn't really a choice. But I think deciding with students is something that's really, really important to my pedagogy, and I definitely Zipporah's as well, because without it, students don't have agency in what they sing. And when they leave your studio, that's what they're going to be spending most of their time on, no matter how much we want them to practice their vocalizing.
Yeah, and I love all of that, absolutely. And, some of the things that I do to try to make that process a little easier for me, because, for those of us who have large studios, you're picking repertoire for, maybe 20, 30, even sometimes 40 students is a lot of repertoire. And so I like to so when I send my students the repertoire ideas for the semester, I like to have it kind of categorized, this is a contemporary, speech belt song, or this is a Disney and Disney adjacent song, or kind of giving them an idea of the reason I've picked it and what it's going to be in terms of their overall development. I will often have 2 to 3 choices under that category, right? So then they have an option. They can listen to those 3, and often they will like one of them, right? If they don't, they can always suggest something else. But it also helps me to feel a little less overwhelmed with just the massive amount of, repertoire we're trying to go through. You've got a category. Okay, now I can look through my other lists, that I've accumulated and pick what works for this student under that umbrella.
Yeah, I'm so glad, Paul, that you mentioned the Brian Montanok article, because that's exactly what I do now too. And I actually alternate. So like I'll say I want you to give me 3 post Golden Age songs that you are really excited about, and I'll choose one. And then next time I'm going to give you mega musical 3 mega musical songs that I think would be right for you, and you can choose one, and we both have veto power. And just that engagement and exactly, Zipporah, that we, yes, our goal is to continue to grow our knowledge as rapporteurs, but to not have all of that foisted upon us. And Paul, as you said, that that we're engaging the students and teaching them how to and to be excited about. Like I remember, back in the day, going to the library on Saturday mornings and like finding these Paul Creston songs, and I was like, oh my gosh, like nobody's ever sung these. I'm sure somebody did, but I couldn't find a recording of them. And just like the joy of finding stuff that I hadn't heard anyone else sing, right? And that kind of getting our students to understand that that's kind of part and parcel of their job is to discover that, and facilitating that as a teacher, I think is so is a joy. It can be a joy too.
I think one of the other things that's really important for me about that process is that it involves trusting the students, which I think I work with a lot of high schoolers and middle schoolers, and I think one of the things that they don't get a lot of is trust placed upon them in their lives, for better or for worse. And I think there's all learning that we can do. But the idea that, I'm trusting them to say, I think this is a good fit for my voice, or no, I don't think this is a good fit for my voice, and really listening to what they're saying. And then on the other hand, I think there's also power in disappointment that maybe a piece of repertoire didn't work out as well as someone had hoped. And an example that I really love to bring up is I had a 13-year-old post-pubescent boy who really wanted to sing Dear Evan Hansen. And waving through a window was just not going to happen with his voice where it was. And, he really wanted to do it. And I said, well, let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens with it. And, you let me know how it feels, after we work on it a little bit. And after about 2 lessons of it, he's like, this is really hard. And I said, why do you think it's hard? He said, I don't think I should be singing this right now. And then we moved away from it. And neither one of us felt bad about it. Neither one of us was angry or upset. But he said, I get it now. I get why this is not good for my voice. And then we went on and did something else that he enjoyed a lot more. And I think there's a lot of power in that trust to be able to say, yeah, no, I don't think this was a good fit for us, and then move on into something else, because we're all going to sing things that are probably not the best fit for our voice, or someone's going to pay us for something that maybe is not the best fit for our voice, and you got to pay that rent. So I think that involves really getting them to trust you and for you to trust them and hear each other, again, in a much more collaborative way than just saying, this is what you're going to sing, I hope you like it. Yeah, it gives them a lot more agency in what they're doing and learns through those disappointing moments.
I think also, so the flip side of that, I think there's a lot of advantage to the student feeling empowered. And I also think there is something wonderful about the maturing process as a teacher when you can step back, right? That is also, like, I think, a sign of maturing as a teacher, when you can allow there to be that back and forth. You're still there for guidance. There's a lot of times where students bring pieces to me and I say, like, I don't know if this semester is the time for this, but it's going in your file. It's going to stay in your file. Let's revisit this in a year, And then they know I'm listening to them. I hear them. I'm not dismissing their interests, I very often will explain the reasons why I think we should wait. And hopefully, if you've built that kind of relationship of trust with your student, then they will respect your opinion as well. It's really about how you deliver the news, right? So having it be, I hear you, and this is my opinion, and you still are the expert typically, right? That's why they've come to you for a lesson, because they want to learn from you. But they are their artistic contribution, who they are as creative artists, right? Like, how do we keep recentering that, coming back to that, not ignoring that, no matter who we think they are or what roles we think they should play or will play or whatever, it's like, who is this artist?
Yeah.
Just
as we begin our initial descent, I just wanted to end with, where do you go for inspiration in growing your rep knowledge? What are some places that you're like, oh, I'm listening to Spotify, or I'm doing this? I'm just kind of curious, where kind of your go-tos for expanding your own island of repertoire?
I think all over. I don't have a specific place that I really look, but I think talking to colleagues is a big part of it. I have a lot of books and anthologies and things. I do a lot of Google searching. I try and really listen to new shows as they sort of crop up around, and as the soundtracks and things get released, and just try and stay up to date with things as much as possible, which is time consuming, but I think it's really worth it because, one, you have a pulse on what your students are going to bring anyway, which gives you a better sense of that. But then it's also enjoyable to just hear things that you haven't heard before, and to hear things that you don't know and get to explore those. So yeah, I don't have like a specific resource or something I use. It's a lot of, this is what the student needs. I'm going to go hunt until I find it, and pulling at all the threads until I can get to the place that I want to go.
Well, I will also mention that and I have get a chance to thank you publicly, because you, in my book, provided just a wealth of resources in terms of repertoire written by many different intersections of people of different intersections of identity. And I thank you for that. That was really, really helpful. And I can't wait to share it with readers soon. Um, Zipporah, how about you?
Yeah, I like Paul. I listen to a lot of music. I go see tons of shows. I'm always going to see shows, and not just musical theater, but like a lot of different CCM styles. I go to see classical concerts. Boston's a wonderful place for that. There's a lot of variety, here. I go to see recitals, etc. So I'm always taking notes when I hear songs that I'm interested in, right? But then in terms of online resources, so I do a lot of listening to, there's two radio stations, KCRW and KEXP. So KCRW is in Los Angeles. They have a great show called Mornings Become Eclectic. I have discovered so much amazing CCM material for my students. It really is truly eclectic. I love Spotify. So if I'm looking for example, a piece that is like a Kelly Clarkson type of vibe, I will often go to the Kelly Clarkson radio station, which is the one where they do a mix of songs of artists who are kind of in the same style as that. I do that a lot when I'm looking for repertoire. Particularly for shows that are currently running. If someone, for example, like, I want to play Glinda, it's like, okay, well, we may learn the Glinda rep as well, but for the
Sure.
audition, obviously, you're going to find something else. And so I do that a lot. And then, of course, this is another thing that is just really becoming so much better, I feel, in the past, maybe 5 or 10 years, is there are a lot of people like you, David, who are putting together resources. I love musical theater resources. That's Kevin Michael Jones'
Yeah.
website. I go there all the time. I love new musical theater resources. I get a lot of rep ideas from conferences. So for anyone who's never been to like a NATS conference or HAVA conference, that kind of thing, sometimes depending on who's presenting, but I know, David, I think that might actually be how I first came across your work, was that you were presenting at the online NATS conference.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and you had given us this great sheet of like a bunch of really new musicals and new songs that people hadn't heard of, composers. And it was just so great because it's like, oh my God, like I don't have to go do all this, researching myself. Somebody else has done it.
Yeah, my colleague Laura and I put that together. We had so much fun
Yeah.
doing that. Yeah. Oh, that's great.
So,
Yeah, th those are great resources.
yeah. There's a lot of published books as well, but again, it sort of depends. Musical theater, there are some great books. I have one called Songwriters of the American Musical Theater that I use that has actual song lists for a lot of the major composers from, operetta to today. But it is not, I will, the caveat, I think it's an excellent book, but it is not through a DEI lens necessarily. And so we're going to find, the Sondheims and Richard Rodgers and those kind of
Sure.
wonderful composers that we love.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's space for much more.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. I just thank you so much for this conversation today. I really, really appreciate you making time. And I think you just brought up so many wonderful things for us to think about in terms of how we consider repertoire selection with students and places to go and things to think about. And so just thank you so much for that inspiration just in this episode and just to me personally. I'm very grateful to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
It's been a
having
wonderful
us.
day. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the greatest things that came out of teaching vocal repertoire for teaching two last fall was that the young pedagogues sometimes selected songs to assess that were completely unfamiliar to me. And it was a great reminder to me that discovering new repertoire is not an experience reserved only for the student. We teachers get to be inspired by that too. And the more repertoire we discover, the more likely we are able to help a student find a song that feels tailor-made and allows them to flourish. What challenges have you faced with repertoire selection, both for yourself and for your students? How do you circumvent oversung repertoire and create a more equity and student-centered approach for repertoire selection in your studio? Sound off. You can email me at wholeheartedvoicepedagogy@gmail.com, or you can find me on the socials. My handle on most platforms is at Sisco Songs and Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. I would love to hear from you. And just a gentle reminder to subscribe to this podcast on whatever corner of the interweb you found me. The list of great guests keeps coming, I promise you, and we would love to share these ever-growing and evolving conversations with you. More soon. Take care of you.